You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
No guns, no wars, no hateful noise. Just a victory dance, I'll never taste defeat. Where there's nothing done or said that can't be forgiven. Every step you take is on sacred ground. Walk away from death to the land of the living.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's Tuesday night. Welcome. I hope your Monday went well. I hope your Tuesday went even better. They said Tuesday's the most productive day of the week because Monday is your hangover from the weekend. Tuesday, Wednesday is hump day, and you're looking forward to the weekend. The week's half over. Thursday is, oh my God, the day before Friday. And of course, Friday, you might as well take off or take off early. So Tuesday, they say, is the most productive day. I hope your day was as productive as mine. Now, this is Scotty Roberts, of course, over on the Intrepid radio program on Odyssey Radio Network. Just go to ODYSY1.com. That's Odyssey spelt in an odd way, ODYSY1.com. And you can view this broadcast simulcast over on my YouTube channel, and that is youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts, Mr. all spelled out. Now, we've been talking on this show for the last couple of programs about some Native American issues, Native American history. Issues is probably a bad way to put it because I'm not dealing with things that are in the current, the issues that the American Indian movement is facing, that the Native American culture is facing here in the United States, but I'm dealing with some of the history and things that I think many of us probably did not grow up learning. Now, I am a product of being born in 1960, going to grade school in the mid to late 1960s, and into middle school and high school in the 70s. I'm a product of the civil rights movement and all that started happening in public education during those days. And so I think I have a pretty good handle on the things that were, at least that were taught us at that era, not a product of the older world where some of these things we didn't understand and we didn't assimilate them into our way of doing living life and doing business until these movements took place in the late 60s. And so learning all of this stuff, it's got its edge to it, I think, which can get a little too, for my liking, if you dig into it, perhaps a little too liberally progressive. Not that those all by themselves are bad words, but when we elevate feelings over facts, we have a problem. So if you can keep all this stuff in the factual category and let your emotions do what they're supposed to do with them, then I think you're kind of on the right page. So all of this stuff was stuff I appropriated as a kid. I also maintained my status as the sole conservative in my household while I was growing up. We had a liberal DFL, that's a Democrat Farm Labor in the state of Minnesota, family that I grew up in, and I was decidedly the Nixon supporting. Who else was? I was against Jimmy Carter as I got into my older teens, and of course I was a Reagan voter. When I reached the voting age, I voted for Reagan twice for 2 different elections. So that's the kind of kid I was growing up. I had a conservative bent from the beginning, and so you've got to be very careful about current politics that get wrapped around any of these issues. So let's do this for the moment. Let's take current politics and set them aside, and let's look at the pure history and find out what happened. And I think, as we all know, history is written by the victors, by the conquerors, and they're the ones who put pen to paper and record what happened. And many times what you read in history isn't exactly what happened. So a good historian, a good archaeologist, anthropologist, you talk about all those kinds of fields, they are people who dig in a little deeper and try to find out the truth and the facts that are below the surface of the story that is told or the emotive story that is passed on. Let's get down to the facts. And history is, period. History is. It's neither good nor bad. It's neither holy nor evil. It's neither feelings or just facts alone. History is just there. It's amoral, is how I meant to say that. It's amoral. It doesn't have morals. It's not a moral issue. It's a thing of what is and what is not. And so in looking at history, it's sometimes very good to pull out the facts, which is what I've been doing with some of this Native American history that I think we all have either missed or at least need to be reminded of. Now, what that can do is it can bring up deep emotions about certain things. And so then we have to balance that against what we know factually, against what we know we can do, as opposed to having knee-jerk or emotional reactions to them alone. Emotions alone cannot sustain a good argument. You have to have emotions coupled with fact. And so that's what I've been doing here, is trying to disseminate fact, but at the same time, I express emotion. It's like I said when I first read this book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and once again I was going to bring it over here, and I'm not sure where in my office it is. It's on a shelf somewhere laying around here, and if it was in sight, I'd go grab it. I'd stand up and walk away from the mic. I'm going to turn around here, and it's not on... Oh, yes, it is. Here it is. It's on this shelf behind me. No wonder I couldn't find it. This is a book that I've been referencing many times. It's called Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and it's by the late D. Brown, and it's an Indian history of the American West. And as I alluded the other day, many times we look at the history of the conquering of the American West, the winning of the West, the westward expansion of the United States, while looking westward. And metaphorically speaking, have we ever stopped and turned around and looked at the story while looking eastward? What was coming at the peoples who were already here? What happened to their way of life? And you have to ask yourself questions. Does the conquering of the American West and the taking away of these lands and pushing these people onto reservations, was that a morally good thing for the United States to do? Now, we know that it has given us the United States as we understand it today, geographically, and we have the sea to shining sea nation. But what happened to the peoples who were here? And this isn't all that long ago, because we can say, well, this type of thing took place. Look at the Roman Empire. Look at Alexander the Great before that. Look at all these great conquerings of empires throughout the ages. Yet this history of the Native American peoples is only as old as maybe some of our great-grandfathers and great-grandmothers. Now, I know my age, being born in 1960, the last big massacre of Native Americans that took place, is considered to be, was Wounded Knee in 1890. Now, I was born 70 years after that happened. That's not a very long time, because you look at present day today, we are, 74, 75 years from the end of World War II. Look how recent World War II is in our history. So if you put it in perspective, many of our grandfathers fought in World War II. And unless you're much younger than I am, it could have been your great-grandfathers, great-grandmothers as well. So relatively recent history, we're talking most of the events took place pre-Civil War, during the Civil War, and post-Civil War, and led up into the 1870s, 80s, and 90s before it was done. And in the 1890s, it was pretty much over. And other than that, it was the reservation life, the atrocities that took place at reservations, the broken promises of the American government, the ongoing diminishment, would be a good way to put it, of the Native American peoples. And if you were anything like me, here in the state of Minnesota, we have several reservations. And to me, growing up, while I didn't form an opinion as a young kid, I remember my experience with Native American culture was seeing homeless and drunken Indians on the streets in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And it wasn't until I started looking into that issue and trying to appropriate some of the history so I could understand why that happened. And frankly, it wasn't just because I saw a drunk Indian on the street. It was because somebody told me, hey, you should look into that, why those people are that way. Because I may have made a remark like, wow, are there any Native Americans that exist today that are not drunken Indians on the street or living in some project in the suburbs of or in the inner city of Minneapolis? That was my take as a young kid. And it wasn't until I started looking into this stuff a little deeper and started understanding why that came to pass. So I'm doing a lot of introducing here of the topic, reintroducing of the topic, and I want to get into the meat a little bit. But I will say again, and I'll hold this up again, if you want to read a good book on the Indian perspective of what happened in the taking of the American West, get D. Brown's book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. It's a classic. You can find this book, of course, I've got it in soft cover. If you're like me, you like hardcovers. I don't have this one in hardcover yet. But you can also, if you prefer having no books at all, you can get it for Kindle, and it's easy to read. It's not a boring, dry history book. As a matter of fact, as I said yesterday, there were times I was reading this book for the first time 25 years ago, and it was so emotionally overwhelming that I had to put it down. I said, I can't read any more of that right now. I can't take any more of that right now. It's like it would grind you in places to an emotional low, where when you started accumulating this knowledge and realizing what had taken place, that just that one more little bit of history that I read, I remember reading about, I think it was Otter Tail and his village and how it was attacked, and I was well into the book, and I put it down because of all the events with this person up to that point, and then his village is attacked, they're all slaughtered, and I put the book down. I said, I can't read this anymore. I can't appropriate any more of that on an emotional level. And of course, I did eventually pick it back up, and I read it. So this book is the 30th anniversary edition that I picked up several years ago now. So this book was written in the 70s and revised several times by the author. So pick it up. But yesterday we were reading about some of these transcripts. And I was reading directly from some of the transcripts of some of these council meetings that had taken place. And we had gone through, I was really trying to set up the path that laid out the path to why there was the rise of this man named Wavoka, who was the kind of Native American messiah, they called him. He wanted to revive the old ways, and he wanted to do it through peaceful means. And so and he started what was called the ghost dance, which spread around to the different tribes. And so I want to get back into this just a little bit. We ended with Sitting Bull, and he was meeting with the council. And he wasn't so sure anymore about the trustworthiness of any white men. But he said that if he had to make a mistake, he was willing to apologize for it. And he sent word to the commissioners that he would like to have another council after this first one ended. And he had said that I'm here to apologize to you for my bad conduct. That's how he began. And he says, and to take back what I said, I will take it back because I consider I've made your hearts bad. And what I take back is what I said to cause the people to leave the council. And I want to apologize for leaving myself. Now, I will tell you my mind, and I will tell you everything straight. I know the Great Spirit is looking down upon me from above, and will hear what I say. Therefore, I will do my best to talk straight, and I'm in hopes that someone will listen to my wishes and help me to carry them out. And keep in mind, he was really kind of in a little tit-for-tat back and forth with the leader, the one-star general, who was leading this all, and he wanted that general to recognize who he was. Do you recognize me? Do you know who I am? And he's not saying, do you know my name, Sitting Bull? Do you recognize my face? He was trying to get that guy to admit in the council, you are the great chief. And he's saying, recognize my position. And we all want that respect. And he was, in essence, he was demanding that respect from the council. And, of course, the council did not want to acknowledge that because to them, these are all subjugated people and they're put on the reservation. They're trying to negotiate for land. And so Sitting Bull went on to review the history of the Sioux during his lifetime. He listed the government's broken promises, which were almost endless in his accounting. He said, quote, if a man loses anything and goes back and looks carefully for it, he'll find it. And that's what the Indians are doing now when they ask you to give them the things that were promised them in the past. And I do not consider that they should be treated like beasts. And that's the reason I've grown up with the feelings I have. The Great Father, and he's referring to the President of the United States, the Great Father sent me word that whatever he had against me in the past had been forgiven and thrown aside, and he would have nothing against me in the future. And I accepted his promises, and I came in, meaning he came in from the wild when he was up in Canada, and he came in, he turned himself in. He says, and he told me not to step aside from the white man's path, and I told him I would not. And I'm doing my best to travel in that path. I feel, just listen to his words, that's just heart-wrenching. He said, I was told to not step aside from the white man's path, and I told him I would not, and I'm doing my best to travel in the white man's path. I feel that my country has gotten a bad name, and I want it to have a good name. It used to have a good name, and I sit sometimes and wonder, who is it that's given it a bad name? And Sitting Bull here, he went on to describe the conditions of the Indians. They had none of the things that the white men had. If they were to become like white men, then they had to have the tools and the livestock and the wagons that the white men have. And he went on to say, because that's the way white people make a living. So in essence, what the United States government did was want all these Native American tribes to accept the white man's ways, the United States, and yet they pushed them into reservations and gave them nothing to work with after having conquered them completely. Yet they promised those things. And so instead of accepting Sitting Bull's apology graciously and listening to what he had to say, the commissioners immediately launched an attack against him. Senator John Logan scolded Sitting Bull for breaking up the previous council and then for accusing the committee members of being drunk. Remember in the other council, he says, you're all drunk on whiskey or something. And so instead of accepting it and having a spirit of conciliation, Logan just started ripping into this great war chief. And he said, I want to further say, this is Logan, I want to further say that you're not a great chief of this country. Logan continued, that you have no following, no power, no control, and no right to any control. You are on an Indian reservation merely at the sufferance of the government. You are fed by the government, clothed by the government, your children are educated by the government, and all you have and are today is because of the United States government. If it were not for the government, you would be freezing and starving today in the mountains. I merely say these things to you to notify you that you cannot insult the people of the United States of America or its committees. The government feeds and clothes and educates your children now and desires to teach you to become farmers and to civilize you and make you as white men. Can you believe that bullshit? Could you imagine if a senator stood up today and said that to anybody? And putting this in context, remember, this is a people that they believed they could push off their land and subjugate. They utterly conquered them. They killed them. They massacred them. And they saw no problem with it. Remember the words of Sheridan? Old General Sheridan from the Civil War, who is now part of the American Indian problem and subduing it post-Civil War. He said the only good Indian is a dead Indian. This is what these people were working on. Now, to speed the process of making the Sioux as white men, the Indian Bureau assigned James McLaughlin to head the agency at Standing Rock. Yes, that same Standing Rock reservation that's been in the news in recent years for the oil pipeline. And he was known as White Hair, as the Indians called him. He was a veteran of the Indian service. And he was married to the half-breed, which is now a politically incorrect term, believe it or not, the half-breed Santee woman. And his superiors were confident that he could efficiently destroy the culture of the Sioux and replace it with the white man's civilization. Now, I am all for integration, especially nowadays, with the migrants that come into this country, with the immigration here. I believe if you're from another country and you're seeking to live here in the United States, you need to assimilate into our culture. That does not mean strip you of your heritage. And this is what they were trying to do. They were trying to destroy the culture of the Sioux and replace it with the white man's civilization. Rip it away. Even something as what would seem very small, when they put Native American children into white schools, they would put them in uniforms and they'd shave their hair. They'd cut their hair all down. They'd cut off the locks and the braids. Just things like that to make them assimilate. And, there was a movie that was made a few years ago based on Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. Now, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, the book is not a storybook. It's an accounting of history. But they made a movie out of it. And there was one scene where there was a Lakota who had to be sent away on the train to go to white school. And his father was outwardly was a big supporter of the whites. And you could tell it wasn't in his heart. It was just something he did. He said, we have to accept Christianity. We have to accept the white ways. And in this movie, there's a scene, and I may find this and post it over on my Facebook channel, or maybe link it up here on my YouTube. But there was a scene where he's saying goodbye to his son, and he's putting him on the train. And as the train's going away, this Native American man, and this is taken from true accounts of these people, he started singing, Jesus, lover of my soul. That's Jesus, lover of my soul. He's singing this in sorrow as his son is being taken away on the train. And as he's singing it, he's singing, Jesus, lover of my soul. And he morphs into this, hey, hey, hey. And I don't know the proper vowel enunciation to make, but he broke into Native American song. And it was a very sad scene. This is what they faced. The death of their culture. And they were being forced to become something else. Not just assimilating to culture, but assimilation with eradication. And it was forced on them. And folks, we're at the end of the first segment, maybe even a little over time, so I'm going to cut out here for 2 minutes. You sit right there. We'll be back.
The earth belongs to the white man. The There's no future outside his world. You must go. You must go.
Jesus, lover of my soul, let me to thy heart fly, while the near and far
All right, folks, welcome back. Thanks for sitting here and waiting for me through the break. That gets a little tough emotionally for me, some of those issues. You can see that those are the things, what I went out with on the first segment, that raises the emotional level for me. Although it's factual, it still is a problem with the emotions. So it's dealing with those. Folks, you're listening to me, Scotty Roberts, here on the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network, and that's at Odyssey1, ODYSY1.com, and you're watching, hopefully you're also watching the the blah, 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 I can say that, that was fantastic enunciation right there, my simulcast over on my YouTube channel. You can watch the video, join in the live chat, at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. So we were talking about and reading into some of these transcripts, which I think are such an amazing thing for us to have historically, these documents. Because we can look back and we can see exactly what was said, by whom. And the stenographers wrote this stuff down. And so we ended with, it was Senator John Logan scolding Sitting Bull for the stance that he took. Not for the apology he made and the conciliation he was making to the council, but for his previous thing that he was apologizing for. And he took them to task for not assimilating to being civilized by the United States government so they could become more like white men. Now, I have no problem with assimilation. I think assimilation is necessary. You come to this country of your own free will, you assimilate. That does not mean you give up your heritage. It means you assimilate to the culture you're in. Now, what was different here is that these were not willing immigrants to this country. These were a conquered people being forced to do this. It's very different. Now, to speed this process of making the Sioux into white men, they appointed McLaughlin, however you want to say that. They called him Whitehair, the Indians did. And he attempted to diminish Sitting Bull's influence by dealing with a Native American chief named Gall, Gall, in matters involving the Hunkpapas, and with John Grass for the Blackfoot Sioux. And every move the Whitehair made was calculated to keep Sitting Bull in the background, and to demonstrate to the Standing Rock Sioux that their old hero was powerless to lead or to help them. So this was all very calculated. Now, take out the immorality of what had taken place here overall, and just look, you can understand if you've got a leader that was a symbol of resistance, you don't want the people looking to him as a leader. And so this is what they did. They tried to diminish who he was. And they circumvented him. Now, Whitehair's maneuvers had no effect whatsoever on Sitting Bull's popularity with the Sioux. And all visitors to the reservation, Indian or white, they all wanted to meet Sitting Bull. This is why you see so many pictures of Sitting Bull out there from the era. People just wanted their picture taken with him. They wanted him to sign a picture. Things like that. And so in the summer of 1883, when the Northern Pacific Railroad celebrated the driving of the last spike into its transcontinental track, one of the officials in charge of the ceremony decided it would be fitting for an Indian chief to be present to make a speech of welcome to the great father, the President of the United States, which was Ulysses S. Grant, and other notables. And Sitting Bull was the choice. No other Indian was even considered, and a young army officer who understood the Sioux language was assigned to work with the chief in preparation of a speech. And it was to be delivered in Sioux and then translated by the officer. And so on September 8th, Sitting Bull and the young bluecoat arrived at Bismarck for the big celebration. And they rode at the head of the parade and then sat on the speaker's platform. And when Sitting Bull was introduced, he arose and began delivering his speech in Sioux, in Lakota. And the young officer listened in dismay. Sitting Bull had changed the flowery text of welcome. You want to know how Sitting Bull started? He said this. This was at the driving of the Golden Spike ceremony. He says, "I hate all the white people. You are thieves. You are liars. You have taken away our land and made us outcasts." And knowing that only the army officer could understand what he was saying, Sitting Bull paused occasionally for applause. He bowed, he smiled, and he uttered a few more insults. At last he sat down, and the bewildered interpreter, this army officer, took his place. The officer had only a short translation written out, a few friendly phrases, but by adding several well-worn Indian metaphors, he brought the audience to its feet with a standing ovation for Sitting Bull. And the Hunkpapa chief was so popular that the railroad officials, pardon me, I've got an alarm going off on my phone, sorry about that, such professionalism. He was so popular that the railroad officials took him to St. Paul for another ceremony. That's St. Paul, Minnesota, not far from right here. It's where I lived for a lot of my life. And now during the following summer, the Secretary of the Interior... By the way, I just got to tell you, where I live now, I'm in western Wisconsin, about 45 minutes from the heart of the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul. Two cities that are so close they become one big metro urban area. And the capital city being St. Paul. Well, you go out to the west of Minnesota and cross the border, and you're in Dakota territory. The North and South Dakota, past Fargo and Moorhead and all of that. You can drive across the Dakotas, go through the Black Hills, through the reservation land out there, and you cross the far west border of either North or South Dakota, and you end up in Wyoming. And this is where, of course, within an hour you could be at the Custer battlefield on the greasy grass. So all of this activity, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, the Dakotas, that whole region is all Native American territory from the old days before they became states in the United States. And it was off of these lands that the Native American tribes were driven. So this is all very close to home, some of this stuff. So during the following summer, the Secretary of the Interior authorized this tour of 15 American cities for Sitting Bull. And appearances created such a sensation that William F. Buffalo Bill Cody, Buffalo Bill, decided he must add the famous chief to his Wild West show. And the Indian Bureau offered some resistance to the proposal at first, but when Whitehair McLaughlin was queried, he was enthusiastic. By all means, he said, let Sitting Bull go with the Wild West show. And that got him off the reservation. And at Standing Rock, Sitting Bull was a constant symbol of Indian resistance. And remember, the U.S. government wanted that squashed. And so McLaughlin was like, get him out there. Go ahead. And he would have liked Sitting Bull to go on tour forever, frankly. And so in the summer of 1885, Sitting Bull joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And he traveled throughout the United States. Boos and catcalls were sometimes sounded for the killer of General George Armstrong Custer. But after each show, these same people pressed coins on him for copies of his signed photograph. And Sitting Bull gave most of the money away to the band of the ragged, hungry boys who seemed to surround him wherever he went. And he once told Annie Oakley, remember Annie Oakley? What's the word for marksman? Show person, marksman. Another one of the Wild West show's stars. That he couldn't understand how whites could be so unmindful of their own poor. And he said, the white man knows nothing, or knows how to make everything, he said, but he doesn't know how to distribute it. How about that? There's politics for you. And after the season ended, he returned to Standing Rock with 2 farewell presents from Buffalo Bill, a huge white sombrero, ole, and a performing horse. And the horse had been trained to sit down, raise one hoof at the crack of a gunshot. And in 1887, Buffalo Bill invited Sitting Bull to accompany his show on a tour of Europe. But the chief declined. I'm needed here, he said. There is more talk of taking our lands. And so the land grab kept going. The U.S. government, who had put all these Indians on reservation land, now wanted it all back. But they had these pesky treaties in the way. And so they were trying to find legal means of stripping the tribes from their land. And, of course, what could then make it more necessary for the Native Americans to adapt to white culture and assimilate in on the level that they wanted them to, than to have no place to live. And so the commissioners offered the Indian 50 cents an acre for their land. This was the Great Sioux Reservation, which had been divided, by the way, into 6 smaller reservations, leaving 9 million acres open for settlement. 50 cents an acre, they offered them. Sitting Bull immediately went to work to convince Gall and John Grass that the Sioux would not stand for such a swindle. They had no more land to spare. And for about a month, the commissioners tried to persuade the Standing Rock Reservation Indians that Sitting Bull was misleading them, and that the land cessation was for their own benefit, and that if they failed to sign, they might lose the land anyway. Now, how would that be? But this is what they tried to convince the people. And only 22 Sioux signed at Standing Rock, after failing to obtain the required 3/4 of signatures at Crow Creek and Lower Brule agencies. The commissioners just gave up. And without even venturing into Pine Ridge or Rosebud, they returned to Washington and recommended that the government ignore the treaty of 1868 and take the land without consent of the Indians. And they sought for more ways to illegally take this land away. And in 1888, the United States government, they weren't quite ready to abrogate this treaty. But the following year, Congress took the first step towards such an action if it became necessary. What the politicians preferred was to force the Indians into selling a large portion of their reservation out of fear that it would be taken away from them if they refused to sell. And should this scheme work, the government wouldn't have to break the treaty. And so they set about means. Now, this is interesting because I have talked about this on my show before. I wrote an article a while back, and in it I made reference to a little argument that broke out with my former in-laws at a Thanksgiving, and we're talking a good 25 years ago. And it was at a Thanksgiving dinner that some of my brothers-in-laws were avid fishers, anglers, and they were talking about how in the state of Minnesota, up at Lake Mille Lacs, which is one of the big lakes. If you take a look at a map of Minnesota, it's the big lake right in the center of the land of 10,000 lakes. On Leech Lake, Lake Mille Lacs, and other places, a lot of the fishing resorts up there were losing money because the native tribes that were on the reservation there had treaty rights going back into the 1800s that determined how many fish they could take by spearfishing. And so the Native Americans, they would take their limit, and they'd sell their own. They'd feed their people, and they'd sell it at market. And, of course, the anglers didn't like this because they were reducing the number of fish. And it was a problem for the tourist industry. So what were they trying to do? Just 25 years ago, they were trying to rescind the treaty rights of the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe from being able to take their limit and fish. And the way they were going about this was saying, well, there's not really this is the justification. There's not really a full-blooded Ojibwe left. Those treaties were written for full-bloods. Everybody's which just wasn't true. There was a lot of integration, yeah, but there were a lot of pure-blooded, if you will, quote-unquote, pure Native American-blooded people that still lived on those reservations. So they were looking for ways, even in my history as an adult, 20 years ago, which is nothing, trying to rescind treaty rights, trying to find loopholes like that so they could take the land away and rescind their right to fish. And so, knowing that the Indians back in 1888 trusted General George Crook, officials in Washington first convinced him the Sioux would lose everything unless they voluntarily agreed to break up the reservation, and Crook agreed to serve as the chairman of a new commission, and he was authorized to offer the Indians $1.50 per acre instead of 50 cents, so 3 times. With 2 earnest politicians, Charles Foster of Ohio, William Warner of Missouri, Crook journeyed to the Great Sioux Reservation in May of 1889. He was fully determined to obtain the required 3/4 of adult male signatures. 3 stars left his blue uniform in Chicago and prepared to meet his former enemies in rumpled gray flannel suit. He deliberately chose the Rosebud Agency for his first council. Since the assassination of Spotted Tail, the Brulés were split into factions, and Crook believed that they were unlikely to offer any kind of united front against signing their land away. And so he went through this whole process. Now, folks, I can already see I've got less than 10 minutes left in this segment, and the problem is I'm not even getting to Wovoka and the ghost dance and the revivalist movement. It's coming. These are all the things. I thought I could bullet point this and get through this. This is history, folks, and I'm trying to I've always said that history, which some people, their eyes glass over just when you mention the word, I'm trying to make it interesting so you can understand it as well as enjoy it. I know when John Ward and I were working on History Trippers and presenting that television show, one of the things that networks bristled at was, oh, God, even the name alone, History Trippers? Got to come up with a better name. You're going to lose an audience just by saying the word history. And that came from the History Channel. So just to let you know, people tend to tune out when they hear the word history. But if you can make history enjoyable and exciting, it's good to read. But here I've been building this whole case for why the Native Americans, just a few years later, started looking to this prophet, this Native American Messiah, whose name was Wovoka. And we're getting there, and this is all leading up. We're already in 1889, which is a year away from Wounded Knee, which was where they were massacred while dancing the ghost dance of Wovoka. So, these guys that went up from the government, these senators, this former general, who was looking, a crook, who was looking to take their land away, he reckoned without Hollowhorn Bear, who insisted that the commissioners call all the chiefs of the 6 agencies together for one council instead of traveling from one to the other. Hollowhorn Bear said, "You want to make everything safe here," he said accusingly, "and then go on to the other agencies and tell them we've signed." Now, Crook replied to the that the Great Father had ordered the commissioners to consult with the Indians at the different agencies, quote, "because it is spring now, and if you all come together at one place, your crops will all suffer," end quote. Can you say bullshit? So now Hollowhorn Bear refused to cooperate, and so did High Hawk. "The land you've now surveyed out for us is but a very small piece," High Hawk said, "and I expect my children to have children and grandchildren and get all over the country, and now you want me to cut off my tool and not make any more children?" Tool, by the way, was a word, and it's in quotations even in the stenographer's notes of these proceedings. It didn't mean tool. He was talking about his standing bear down below. So, he said, "Now you want me to cut it off and not make any more children?" And Yellowhair added in, "Whenever we give you any land, we never take it back. So this time we want to consider well before we give up this land." And then Crook said, "The white men in the East are like birds. They're hatching out their eggs every year, and there's not room enough in the East, and they have to go elsewhere. And they come west, as you've seen them coming for the last few years. And they're all still coming, and they're going to come until they overrun all of this country, and you can't prevent it. Everything is decided in Washington by the majority, and these people come out west and see that the Indians have a big body of land they're not using, and they say, 'We want that land.'" Now, do you see the reasoning that they were using back then? People want the land. They're going to take it from you if you don't sell it to us, so you better sell to us. He's saying he's doing it for their benefit, which was bullshit as bullshit comes. And after 9 days of discussing this, a majority of the Brules followed Crook's advice and signed. And the first signature on the agreement was that of Crow Dog, the assassin of Spotted Tail. Remember that from a couple of nights ago? At Pine Ridge in June, the commissioners had to deal with Red Cloud, who demonstrated his power by surrounding the council with several hundred of his mounted warriors. Although Red Cloud and his loyal lieutenants stood firm, the commissioners managed to secure about half of the Oglalla's signatures. And to make up imagine that, being surrounded by the warriors all on horses, on horseback, and there was no army presence there. It was a show of force. It was a show of intimidation. And so, to make up the difference, they moved to the smaller agencies, and they obtained signatures at Lower Brule, Crow Creek, and Cheyenne River. And on July 27th, they arrived at Standing Rock. And here the decisions would be made. If a majority of the Hunkpapas and the Blackfoot Sioux refused to sign, the agreement would collapse. So Sitting Bull attended the first councils, but he remained silent. His presence was all that was needed to maintain a solid wall of opposition. The Indians gave close attention, Crook said, but gave no indication of favor. Their demeanor was rather that of men who had made up their minds and listened from curiosity as to what the new arguments could be advanced. Now, John Grass was chief spokesman for the Standing Rock Sioux. He said, "When we had plenty of land," he said, "we could give it to you at your own prices, whatever you had in mind to give. But now we've come down to the small portion there is to spare. And you wish to buy the balance? We're not the ones who are offering our lands for sale. It's the Great Father that is after us to sell the land. That's the reason the price that is put on the land here we think is not enough. Therefore, we don't want to sell the land at that price. And Sitting Bull and his followers, of course, didn't want to sell at any price. So as White Thunder had told the Dawes Commission 6 years earlier, their land was the dearest thing on earth to them. And after several days of fruitless discussion, Crook realized that he couldn't win any more converts and general councils, and he enlisted Agent James McLaughlin in a concerted effort to convince individual Indians that the government would take their land away if they refused to sell. Sitting Bull remained unyielding. Why should the Indians sell their land in order to save the United States government the embarrassment of breaking a treaty to get it? And that's what it was all about. The United States government rescinding the treaties that were written in perpetuity, which they had already started breaking up years before. And so McLaughlin had secret meetings with Grass, and they tried to find ways to get to take away the land if they refused to sell it. I talked with him until he agreed that he would speak for its ratification and work for it, McLaughlin said. Afterwards, finally, we fixed up the speech he was to make, receding from his former position gracefully, thus to bring him the active support of the other chiefs and settle the matter. And without informing Sitting Bull, McLaughlin arranged for a final meeting with the commission on August 3rd. The agents stationed his Indian police in a 4-column formation around the council grounds to prevent any interruption by Sitting Bull or any of his ardent supporters. So Sitting Bull was not welcome at this meeting. And John Grass had already delivered the speech which McLaughlin had helped him write before Sitting Bull forced his way through the police and entered the council circle. And for the first time he spoke, Sitting Bull said, and I'm almost out of time here, "I would like to say something unless you object to my speaking, and if you do, I will not speak. No one told us of this council, and we just got here." And Crook glanced at McLaughlin. "Did Sitting Bull know that we're going to hold a council?" "Yes, sir," McLaughlin lied. "Yes, sir, everybody knew it." And at this moment, John Grace and the chiefs moved forward to sign the agreement. It was all over. The Great Sioux Reservation was broken into small islands, around which would rise the flood of white immigration. Before Sitting Bull could get away from the grounds, a newspaperman asked him how the Indians felt about giving up their lands. "Indians," Sitting Bull shouted. "There are no Indians left but me." That's where we've got to end for tonight. Still haven't gotten to Wovoka, but you can see what's happening here. Not only are they conquered, subjugated, driven onto reservations, the United States is continually breaking its word to take those reservations away and to find any legal means to do it. So they would not have egg on their face for breaking the reservation or the treaties. There's more on this. We're going to hit this again tomorrow. We could be on this for a few days. I hope you're enjoying this. We'll be back tomorrow night. Thanks for being here tonight. And, God, that's all I've got to say. If you got any comments, please add them down in the comments section or write me. You know how to find me. And we'll see you again here tomorrow night. Have a good night. See you right after this 23-hour break.